have done this painting several times in the past like week or two. So some of this was for squadron events or private parties. So luckily you can see variations of the design and come up with your own ideas. So in this first rendition, I have it with a few less trees. You can see it's turning into this kind of triangular shape around Big Ben and the Palace of Westminster. So you can do something like that, or you can get more elaborate with it. So if you want to add more trees that lead along to the telephone booth, you can add more leaves and more variation with the branches on the tree. Or like the original design, you can add little details like this to make it look more romantic if you want to have a design like that. So I'll leave that up to you with how you decide to do your painting. Again, you can always experiment with it while you're working. So what you should have if you got the kit, I'm just reusing this, but this is the stencil that we'll be using today. And you'll notice that one side has a slightly longer panel for the windows. So you'll want that to be flipped on this side. And you'll notice like on this edge right here, this is going to be a little bit longer than this side. So you just want to make sure that this is on the right side of your painting while we're working, just to get the perspective right. So I'm going to be using a 9x12 canvas just so you can see what I'm doing here. I have a few little shadows coming in from my stuff, so I apologize for that. And the rig that I have set up for my phone right now so you can actually see the table. But what I have for the colors we're going to use today is just a limited palette. So we're going to be using cadmium red, ultramarine blue, white, and black. And we're not going to use so much of the black paint when we're creating some of our darker tones because we want to be able to create a more vibrant painting with the area of Big Ben and that background. So we're only going to use this for parts of our design and very minimally. I also have brushes out of the brush kit. These are starting to look a little rough right now. I need to use a little bit of brush cleaner with it. But these are just pretty decent brushes for the quality that we have here and for the price, definitely. So just to quickly go over this for future reference, whenever you start feeling like your brushes are getting a little bit worn out, what you can do is get some brush cleaner. Any kind will work. And if there's like a buildup of paint along the edge of your brush right here where it meets from the bristles where they meet to the ferrule of your brush, you can easily use like a cleaner like that to get it out. So I didn't do that on my last painting and I can already see like it needs a little bit of love, I would have to say. So you'll also want a pencil to be using and just some paper towels and a little bit of water. And on a day like today, especially in the summertime where it's a little bit more hot and humid, you'll notice that your paints are going to want to dry quite a bit faster than normal. So what you'll want to do is make sure that you're adding just a little bit of water to your brush and to your paints as you're working. Otherwise, your paints are going to start building up in your bristles of your brush really fast. So you don't want that. That's going to kill your brush. Sometimes you can get it out later, but most likely, you know, once it's in there with acrylic paints, it's really hard to get out. So the more love that you give to your brushes with cleaning them with just soap and water afterwards, the better. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we are going to start creating these little guidelines in here for our painting. So we're going to sketch in this area here where the rails of like the boardwalk are. And for this design, we're mostly working, you know, from a memory of London versus an actual space. So we have these landmarks that you would see in the city of London, like Big Ben. We have these type of spires and other things in the background to give you the illusion of the Gothic architecture from the Palace of Westminster. And then obviously the telephone box, which is a very distinct landmark for the UK. So other things that we're adding in it are just to create framing for it. So like I said, we'll have our trees that go around it. You can choose whether or not you want to add other details like this, Or you can keep it simple if you'd like, where you have just a few trees that lead around the edge of the canvas. So here we're just doing kind of like a hazy effect with the background to create the illusion of like the River Thames and, you know, the boardwalk area, just like if it would be like a foggy day in London. Okay, so to create those guidelines, what you can do if you're not feeling comfortable with perspective is you can lay down two of your brushes to help you with that guideline. And like we see here, we're just going to have this side here be a little bit more narrow and then to widen out towards the edge of your right side of your canvas. And that's just going to create the illusion of like perspective for you. So these don't have to be perfect lines or anything. You just want to make sure that you have a reference for yourself. And like I said, you can hold this down if it helps you to create like a guideline for it. So I'm just going to quickly sketch that out. Again, I'm just making sure this one side is a little bit more narrow than the other. And then what I'll do is just bring that line down a little bit more. So again, most is going to be covered with paint, so we're just making sure that we have a guideline set up for ourselves. And I'll make this a little bit darker so you can see what I'm doing, but in your case, you don't have to do such a heavy line. Just have like several lines now from the sketching, just like that, okay? And we're not gonna worry about doing any sort of details along here or with the rest of the piece until we get to the telephone box. But you can get an idea of where this is going to be on your canvas by just placing that down. And I've already used this once, that's why it looks a little bit messy. So yours is most likely gonna look like that. But it just gives you an idea of where that telephone box is going to go. Okay, now the first part of this is quite simple. We're just going to be mixing some type of like violet, Mars violet hues within here. So we're only focusing on this section right here of our canvas. We're not going to worry about any other details. We're just going to get right into this part. So we'll create a little box shape and a tower shape for Big Ben, and then everything else will diffuse out from that section. But to create that color, what we'll do is mix together a little bit of white, mostly white, with a tiny bit of ultramarine blue and cadmium red. And I can tell I'm talking too fast because I'm starting to jumble up my words. I get excited sometimes when I paint. It's just fun. But anyway, so I'm going to just pull over a little bit of that white. And I'll dip into a tiny bit of my blue, tiny bit of my cadmium red. And we can always make this a little bit darker, just so it stands out from our background a little bit. And that will create that really pretty purpley tone. And if you use too much blue, it's going to look more like a baby blue, which is fine. For me, I'm trying to create a little bit more of a muted tone since we're going to be having red in the trees and with the telephone box. There we go. That's closer to the tone I want. I just had to go a little bit darker. Now with your brush, it's going to want to start building up some of that paint on the end of it. So to stop it from having like big blobs of paint on your brush, you can just press down a little bit on your plate or whatever you're using, or you can spin it a little bit if you're using a rounded brush. And what I'm going to do is add just a little bit more water to this, just because it's a warm day and this is going to want to dry really fast on the paper plate. Okay, so I'm going to set that aside for just 1 second. And what I'm going to do is just map in a quick little square shape for the Big Ben clock tower. And it doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to be going over several different um, parts of the background. So it's just plotting in that major shape. And I'm also going to paint down the bottom section of it to create that tower shape. And I'm leaving a little bit of room on the top here because we have these spires that are going to be coming up. And it creates that triangular shape within it. So I'm just using the broad side of my brush for that, and that's just the Filbert number 12. But if you don't feel comfortable with that, this angled brush is really helpful for other details. For right now, I'm just mapping in these major shapes, so I'm not so worried about where these things are going. And like what you'll see in the examples, we're going to put in a few little lines of this color too along the sides of it to create that illusion of the rest of that architecture. Because this Gothic architecture is very elaborate. It has all these beautiful little details added to it, and we're not going to go that far with our details because it would take much longer than like 2-hour sessions. But if you're up to the challenge, I would always say to get like a reference photo and you can practice working with it. So I'm just going to use the edge of my brush right here, just the narrow side of it, to create some of these sharper lines. And I'm just going in a vertical motion with it to create that illusion of architecture. And I'm not thinking too hard on it because I know that I'm going to go back in with some of my white paints and use that to break up these lines a little bit. Okay. And then what I'm also going to do is I want to have some of this color somewhere on the foreground of my painting here. So I'm going to use that same color to block in this shape right here, this little negative space. And that's going to be our boardwalk area. And I'm just going to quickly put in that background line with the edge of my brush. And I watered this down just a tiny bit too, so I can use these long brush strokes without it pulling on the canvas. So if you're unable to get brush strokes where you can really extend that paint, I would say to use a tiny bit more water on your brush, or sometimes you just need a little bit more paint on your brush to stretch that out. And that will prevent it from getting really gloppy while you're working, because we just want to do like a thin layer of this for our foreground. We'll add in all these other details later. But I know for some of you, you're using larger canvas, so we're not trying to like go through all of our white paint first. You can extend it out with a tiny bit more water while you're working, and that should prevent you from running out of paint. But I gave you some extra paint in there just in case you, were wanting to be a little bit heavier with your tones. Okay. So from here, what I'm going to do is start adding a little bit more white to that mixture, and we're going to start carving out more of these lines in here. So with that same little puddle of paint, I'm just going to lighten that up with a little bit of white. And it really just needs to be lighter than what we have on the canvas so far. What I'm going to do is with that same brush, I'm going to start filling in the white of the canvas that is still exposed. And I didn't want to use like a solid white color, although this is reflecting quite a bit. Let me pull this up so you can actually see the color. It has more of like a pinky tone to it, almost like a very light lilac color. And that's because I don't want there to be like any sort of harsh colors that are straight out of the tube. I typically want to have at least some sort of mixture that makes it more natural looking. So we're just focusing on the bigger sections here, and then we'll switch our brush and go to using a smaller one for some of the other detail lines. And I'm just using canvas board for this because I've painted this several times on regular canvas. But if you'd like, what you can do is go around the edges of your stretched canvas. I didn't do that so much right here, but on the bottom section, I started going in with that other color. And that's if you want to create like a wrapped effect around your canvas. Sometimes it makes it look more complete if you do that. And then it also gives it the illusion that it's continuing past this little space right here. But I tend to have to create multiples of the designs that I make. So sometimes it's just easier to use canvas board for these examples. I'm going to do the same thing down here. And I'm using still vertical brush strokes while I work, just to again cover the white of the canvas. And it's fine if it's covering over a little bit of your lines here. It was, the example that I have on here has a little bit harsher lines than you typically would want for your graphite. I just wanted to make sure you could see what I was working on. And I'm just pulling some of that towards those other lines that we put down, just to create that blended effect with it. Just like that. And you can see there's some lines that are overlapping right here. I'm going to fix that in just a few minutes. But again, for right now, we're just putting in this bottom layer that we can build up from. And you shouldn't have like huge globs of paint on here or anything. This should be relatively thin because I want a little bit of transparency happening between some of these other lines. We're going to be using a technique called glazing for part of this, which is making your colors a little bit more transparent so they can reflect off of each other, kind of similar to how a watercolor works. So we just make them a little bit more transparent by adding a tiny bit more water. However, you know, if you have glazing medium or matte medium at home, that's a great way of doing that without breaking down your colors. But for this, we're not going to extend it too far, so we can just use water for it. Okay. And this is drying very quickly. So it typically only takes about 5 minutes or so to dry a layer, but this is happening within like 30 seconds. So I can tell it's a really hot day. Okay. So I'm going to make sure that I'm cleaning off my brush really well. And I'm going to switch to my other brush. And for this one, I want to have a little bit more control over it because we're going to add some more colors within it, more of like a pinky magenta tone in areas. And then it's also going to give us a chance to kind of clean up any area that looks a little off on the canvas. So I'm going to first, if there's any area that I want to clean up around, let's say the clock tower here, I can do that. And I'm just using my number, I think this is the 6 round brush, but any smaller one will work. You don't have to use these exact materials. It's just easier to feel like you have a little bit more control over those colors. Or if I need to, let's say I need to add a darker tone in areas, I can just go back to that other puddle of paint I was using to extend that out. And I'm just going to make sure that my brush is still damp. And I'm gonna add a little bit more. I feel like I lost some of my spires in here. So with my small brush, I'm just gonna create a few little flicking motions to bring those back in. To create that more triangle shape. And that unfortunately is reflecting a lot. I apologize. So I'll keep that at an angle so you can see more of what I'm doing. So I know I want to add a few more tones in here so it doesn't all look like one solid block. So I'm going to add just a little bit more red to this other little puddle of paint that I mixed and a little bit more blue. Just create a little bit of variety with it. So the red will create a more warm toned violet, while the blue will tend to mute that down. So I want a little bit of both with this. So I'm just going to use a few little flicks of this color just to break that up a little bit. And if for some reason you're creating, ooh, that's sped up for a second. For some reason, if you're creating a tone on top of the other one, there's some texture that might be building up on your canvas. If you go back in with a little bit more water on your brush, that will push that color around a little bit more and give you more control over that color. And canvas board is kind of notorious for this. I don't always like using it for this reason. I feel like that texture is just amplified a little bit more. However, you can get canvas board in bulk for pretty cheap. So if you're practicing, it's really good for that. You don't have to like break the bank while you're learning how to paint. Or if you're just like practicing a design and you're not sure how it'll turn out. And then I can go back in with a little bit of that other color if I need to, just to mute that down a little bit. So it's really easy to mix the paints together on the canvas while they're both damp. So it's not like oil painting where you can just work on top of another color for a long period of time. Kind of at the mercy of the amount of wet paint that's on the canvas and how much time you have. Really, like with acrylics, I always feel like you have to paint a little bit faster than you would with other mediums, especially in like a session like this where we're essentially just like speed painting. So in this case, since we're doing this all online, you can take your time a little bit more with these details while you're working, and then it won't feel so rushed, or like that pressure won't be so apparent while you're painting. I'm gonna do the same thing along this side too, just to warm that up a little bit with a little bit more of that red tone. And I'm not thinking too hard on it. I just want a little bit of variety of that color. I'm going to put a little bit of that within the tower too. And again, it's reflecting a little bit, so I'll hold that up to the light just a tiny bit. Kind of paint at an angle today. Again, you can always go back in with a little bit more of your white paint or slightly muted paint and clean up any areas that might be bothering you with your painting, or any lines that might be getting a little bit lost. And the nice thing about this is that we aren't doing tons of detail. And Big Ben is such an amazing landmark that just the silhouette of it is easily recognized. But up here, I feel like I need to do a little bit of work with these spires. So with my brush, I'm going to hold it more at a vertical angle with a little bit of white paint. And I can essentially start kind of like carving out those little details within it. So it just gives it a little bit more movement with it, makes it look a little bit more intentional with those lines. This side just doesn't want to work with me today. So if that happens to you, what you can do is you can always turn your canvas a little bit and see it from a different angle. And then paint that down. So we'll work on this just a tiny bit more so you can have a chance to add a little bit more detail to your painting. And you can always go in with a little bit more white with your mixture if you want to have just a tiny bit of variety with those colors. You can have certain areas along here with your background where it's not just like that solid tone. We're taking a lot of cues from Impressionist artists where they were interested in capturing fleeting moments. So they would use really fluttery brush strokes and broken brush strokes to create the illusion of time and just fleeting moments and memories. And the interesting thing about them was it was a collection of rejected artists. So they were very talented artists, but they were rejected by more of the academic side of the Royal Academy of Arts and similar places like the Salon. So they all kind of grouped together and boycotted it after getting rejected so many times, because at that point, it was almost impossible for an artist to be seen in exhibitions. So they grouped together, and even though a lot of them didn't really have anything common outside of that, they created their own art movements. And interestingly, although they're a collection of rejected artists, they're probably some of the most well-known artists in the world. So you have like Degas, Monet, Mary Cassatt, and they really just found their place in the art world in such an amazing way. And I feel like most people that, you know, if you don't even go to museums and study art and all of that, they tend to know the names of these artists because they've created such an amazing and recognized art form with this movement. So here we are today in 2020, you know, taking cues from them. I think it's pretty fun. So I'm just adding a little bit of white and muted white with a little bit of red and blue added to it in a few areas. Just anywhere where I feel like it needs to be split up a little bit. You probably don't have to do as much with your design. I'm just being a little bit picky right now for whatever reason. I've painted this design several times now and I always feel like it comes out a little bit different. So it's fun to go back and recreate things and learn from them while you're working. Okay, so we're gonna let this dry here. And if you have the chance, you can always see if this little area for the clock tower is dry, because then you can paint that in really quick. And we're using more of that muted purpley tone, the lilac color, because if we went in with just like a solid white here, it would just stand out far too much for our design. So I'm just gonna quickly map that in. Again, we're doing more of the impressionist style. So it doesn't have to be like a perfect circle with all these details and stuff. It's just the image of it, the symbol of it. And some of it can be a little bit more transparent in areas if you'd like. I just lost that spire, so I'm gonna bring that back. Okay. Now I'm gonna let that sit. I lied, I'm gonna fix this part. Okay, now I'm gonna let it sit. So at this part, we're gonna just work on this section a little bit more too. But I wanna make sure that I'm not losing this line here. So we're gonna create a few more textures within this section. And you'll notice along here, the direction of your brush strokes starts going in more of like a diagonal form versus a vertical form. And that's just to create this illusion of perspective. So this is mimicking what's happening with the rails here. And this is a variety of colors here. So I have a little bit of like a baby blue mixed in, a little bit of a darker like burgundy tone. And this is just doing different levels of red and blue and white mixed together. So in this area right here, we're gonna have the darkest color, and that's just to create that illusion of a shadow for this piece. And also just a few along the rail lines here where we know that there would probably be a little bit of shadow formed there as well. So I'm gonna switch brushes really quick to something a little bit bigger. So I tend to flock to this angled brush here just because you can use it as different lines. And it tends to just help on larger areas. So you can do really detailed areas if you turn it sideways, or you can use that angled side to have a little bit more control over where your brush goes. Because this filbert brush that we were using earlier has a rounded edge to it. So it's great for large areas, but if you're going along something that has this type of line, it's just a little bit easier to use a flat brush or an angled brush. Okay. So like I'm doing with all of my brushes, I always just rinse it off in my water first to soften the bristles. And then with the same little puddle of paint that we have here, we're gonna just go a little bit darker with it So I'm just taking a scoop of red and blue, and then I can add a little bit more of that other mixture to it. And we're just going for something a little bit darker than we already have on our canvas down here. And you can always like take your brush, I'm just pressing it down on the paper plate a little bit harder so I'm not getting big globs of paint. And you can always hold it over this area here to see if that brush is a little bit too, or that paint is a little bit too dark or light. But I think this is a good tone because it's slightly darker than what we have here. So what I'm going to do is just go right up to this edge here, and I'm going to hold this at an angle and start pulling that color down. And what I don't want to do is completely cover over this color that we just put down originally, because we're just trying to create more texture within our piece. So we're going to leave little gaps in areas so that color shows through. And again, this line doesn't have to be perfect. We're going to be putting in the rails with the black paint soon. But you can see I'm just creating a little bit of space between there so you still have that color shining. And this is where if there's a little bit of texture going on with your brush strokes, that's perfectly fine. We're going to use several different layers of paint, so some of that will probably disappear while we're working. Okay. Now while that's still damp, I'm going to mix in just a slightly darker color so we can go and add a little bit to this section that we have on our plate. So we can add a little bit more red and a little bit more blue. So you can get more of like a blue tone in areas if you want, since this is looking all kind of this purpley tone. And again, I'm just going to add some of that in areas. I'm not thinking too hard about where I'm placing this because eventually I'll start creating a pattern in my head. And you'll space these out equally, and it tends to just flatten it when you see more of a pattern with it. And some of the brush strokes can be a little bit longer, so you're not creating that choppy pattern too many times, unless that's more of what you're going for. So just go with your gut. If you see something that you're interested in trying out, you can always do that. And with acrylics, it's always nice because they dry very quickly and they can be covered over easily with another coat of paint. So you can always, experiment and then decide later on if that's something you want to keep. I'm going to do a few more layers of this because, yeah, I need just a little bit more. And we're going to do a little bit more later too. But yeah, I'm going to add a little bit more. So I'm going to add a little bit more red to this section. A little bit more blue. And we're avoiding black paint right now because we don't want to lose all of the vibrancy of these colors. Black paint tends to just dull them down a little bit more. And sometimes that's what you want to do, but in this case, I really want these colors to pop, especially since it's such a limited palette. Those reds will stand out a little bit more if there's more mauves and blue tones surrounding it versus like gray tones. So you can see I'm just doing a slightly darker color, and this is where I'm just going to put it in just a few little areas. And you can switch to the other side of your brush where it's more narrow if you want to make more choppy brush strokes in areas. So I'll leave that up to you. And again, I'm not thinking too hard about the placement of things because I will create a pattern. But I'm making sure I'm not completely covering over areas that I already put down color. So I do want to have that variety of color in this little boardwalk area of my painting. Okay. Yeah, I think that's good. So this will dry pretty quickly. I'm just cleaning off my brush really well. And I'm trying not to keep any of my brushes in the paint or in the water because, especially with some of these angled brushes and pointed brushes here, if you leave them sitting in the water face down, what will happen is that eventually your bristles are going to stay bent the way that they were sitting in the water. And it makes it very difficult for you to paint like that afterwards. So you tend to want to have them standing straight up so they can have a nice point to them. So just like, it's something to practice while you're working. It's really easy just to throw them in the water and forget about them. And that will just, make your brushes a little bit shorter with their lifespan for your paintings. Okay. So the next thing that I can do, I can see a few areas where I still want to clean up around here. They've had a chance to dry, like right along here. I feel like this is getting a little bit wobbly. So I can go in with a little bit more of that muted white paint. And you might not have to do this for yours. It's just a chance while this is drying to add any other details to your painting. This is just a little problem area for me right now for some reason. It happens. Just really want to make sure that shape stands out since that's the center of the painting and it's the focal point. So you always want to spend a little bit more time on an area that is important in your painting. Sounds really obvious, but it's easy to forget when you're working on your design. So I'm going to add just a little bit of white in areas on here to make that stand out just a tiny bit more. I'm not covering over the whole area. I just want a little bit of variety there within it since we have all of these loose brush strokes here. And then you can also, with that color that we just mixed earlier with a little bit more white, you can put in the hands of the clock at whatever time that you want. I'm just using my small round brush to do that. And I'm keeping it quite light, but if you want to, you can make it a tiny bit darker to stand out. And then you can go around the edges of your circle in a few spots just to make that stand out. And then a rule of thumb that I have for myself, typically if there's anywhere where there's an intersecting line or an edge of a line or where things have a sharp curve, I tend to emphasize that with a slightly darker tone. So like along these little corners of the clock tower, you can add a little bit of your darker paint that we mixed just in two of those little corners. And it just gives that illusion of a three-dimensional form. And you can also add that in a few areas as well. But if you were to do like one big line around it, you would flatten out all of the details that you just put in. So you just always want to avoid that when you're working on a piece. And you learn a lot of this in drawing, but a lot of it still applies to painting when you're working on shapes like this that have very distinct forms. but I tend to use just broken lines so there's nothing too harsh for the piece. So this should be almost dry now. There's a few spots on mine that still need a little bit of time to wait. Again, you can always add in other little details in the background if you want to add a little bit more color. You can add some baby blue mixed in, a little bit of that purple that we had. And I always just try and find a way to include some of these other colors within the piece in other sections. It just creates a sense of unity and balance with your colors. And it just makes it a little bit easier for you to see your piece as a whole. Because it's very easy to try and overwork acrylic paint while you're working on it. You might just get frustrated and just keep painting over an area over and over again. However, if you give yourself a chance to let things dry down when you're working on another part of your painting, it keeps that frustration down a little bit more. Let that sit and dry for just 1 second. And then we'll get started on the second section of our piece. So this is almost dry here, and you can always tell if you hold it up to the light, you can see areas where it's just shiny, a little bit shinier. But for the most part, it has a nice matte finish to it. So what you can do if it's already dried for you, we can lie down our stencil. And again, we want to make sure this area here has the longer edge to it versus this side, and that will be the correct angle for you for your piece. And what we'll do is we're only going to focus on drawing in the outline of our telephone booth. We're not going to worry about any of this because we're going to use the stencil to create those lines. So if this is dry here, you can find the placement that you'd like for your piece. I'm going to have this just a little bit further down from this line here, just so it's not like butted up right against it. And I want to give myself a little bit of room for my trees around the edges. So make sure it's like squared up with this edge here. Mine's a little bit wobbly now that I've used it once, but that's okay. So I'll just use my pencil to sketch in the outline. Again, we're not focusing on any of this stuff here, just the outline edge. And you'll see why when we do our next few steps. Now, if you have this on canvas, you just want to make sure you're not pressing down too hard on the stretched canvas because it's going to push it down and move your stencil around a little bit. So if you don't feel comfortable using your fingers to hold it down, you can always use a little bit of tape. You just want to make sure that your colors have dried completely with your paint, else that tends to pick it up a little bit. And we don't need to go really dark with this or anything. It's just giving you that reference line. Okay. Okay. So what we'll do next is we will start painting in the red box here. Actually, We won't do that yet. We're going to paint in the black here first, but we're going to avoid this section. And the reason for that is because the red, if you're going over certain areas with the black, it might be a little bit more difficult to paint in. So what I'm going to do is I'm only going to paint in these black lines here. I'm avoiding this area. But what I'll have to do first is instead of just painting directly out of this big blob of paint, I want to make sure that I dilute this down a little bit. So I want more of like an inky consistency with my black paint. So I'm going to take just like a little scoop of that to the side. And I'm going to dip my brush into my water a few times just to add some of that to my paper plate. And it's like a line between having it too opaque and too transparent. So typically what I do and what I tell my students is that if you feel like you're getting like big globs of paint on your brush, you need to add just a little bit more water to it. However, if you add tons of water, you're going to create more of like a watercolor effect and it will be too transparent. So usually you're looking for something that's more of like an inky consistency. And that will prevent your bristles of your brush from moving around on you when you're trying to do like these long brush strokes where you want like a clean line. And what I tend to do also, just to prevent areas of buildup on my brush, is I will just rotate it a little bit within the paper plate. And that will prevent those big blobs of paint from getting on the end of my brush. You can tell I need just a little bit more water to this. Yeah, that's pretty close. Now for some people, they like to use the edge of their stencil. They can lie it down and then at a vertical angle, they can just have the tip of the brush go across the canvas like you would with a ruler. And you can also do the same thing when you do the rails of your lines in. So that's an option for you if you don't feel comfortable painting some of those lines. Or what I tell my students is you have to think about the way that you're holding your brush. So sometimes it's easier for you to go more of like a vertical line versus a horizontal line. So horizontal lines do tend to kind of arch a little bit. So what you can do is either break these up into a few little lines, which always helps, or you can turn your canvas to something that feels more comfortable to you. So for me, a lot of times I can turn it slightly and then I feel like I'm using more of my arm in a natural motion. However, it's totally up to you. Like we're all a little bit different. So I'm going to load up my brush, make sure there's quite a bit of paint on there. And I'm gonna hold it at a vertical angle. So I'm making sure that it's not bent too much from a different side at a different angle because that will make a larger line. And then I am just going to paint that down. And I'm not too worried about it being a perfect line or anything. I'm gonna leave a little space here because we don't want to go where our telephone booth is. Then I'm gonna do the same line right here. I'm just gonna butt that up right to that line that we just put down. It also helps if you see it at a different angle. I can usually see if I need to clean up a line. If I turn it upside down, I can see where some of that's a little bit wider than other areas. Again, that's being a little bit more nitpicky while you're working, but it's just something to think about. And then for this section, I might go with just a longer line. So you want to make sure that you keep loading up your brush with paint before you do any other lines. And yeah, I'm just going to paint that in. And some people will hold like their arm or rest it against their wrist. If you see like sign makers, they have the most steady hands I've ever seen. I could never do that job. I have like a naturally wobbly hand, so lines like this can be a little bit more challenging for me. I think I also kind of like psych myself out a little bit with it too, because you're like, it has to be perfect. But it really doesn't. There's plenty of ways that you can do it without, you know, stressing yourself out. It's kind of like when you're driving, and if you look too close to the road in front of you, you're going to tend to swerve a little bit more than if you looked ahead. So sometimes with people, they'll blur their eyes a little bit, or they'll look at a different part of their canvas and then draw their line in, and that helps them, stay focused. So it's just like, I think your brain just kind of psychs yourself out. And I'm going to turn it where I can see if there's any areas where I need to like thicken up part of that line. And that one was really wobbly. Oh well. From there, we can put in more vertical lines for the rails. So I just spaced these out a little bit while I was working. So I just have a few along here. And you'll notice with the railings, we have a few highlighted areas. So if there's a line that's really wobbly or something that you're uncomfortable with, we can always do a little highlight over it and hide any sort of piece that might be bothering you with it. So again, don't be concerned if it's a little bit off. It's no problem at all. So I'm going to continue just adding a little bit of paint to my brush. And I'm just going to paint in a few vertical lines. And I'm going to try and keep my brush at a vertical angle where just the end of it is on the canvas. And that just gives you a little bit more control over the weight of the line. And again, if you want to look at it at a different angle, you can always turn it and see if you need to thicken up part of that line in areas. So I tend to turn my canvas a lot, if you notice. Hopefully that's not too distracting while you're working. But it's just, after you start painting for a little while, you find your rhythm and will do it without even thinking so much about how you're moving the canvas. So sometimes it's easier to work on like a tabletop like this versus a canvas like easel. So there's nothing that's like essential for painting when it comes to materials like that. Some people even prefer to like lean it against their body on their lap, and that's like an easy way to feel like you're in control of your line work with it. I'm not going to do that in this video because then you wouldn't see what I'm doing. But just, again, go with whatever you feel comfortable with while you're painting. And that's looking pretty good. at this point, we're just gonna let that sit and dry. You can always make these lines a little bit wider than what I have on the canvas. So just work with whatever method that you'd like. And then now we're gonna go into adding in the red for our telephone booth. So in this one, I'm just using my angled brush, and I'm going to dip directly in my red paint. It's one of the few times today that we're going to be doing that, just straight out of the tube. But I want to make sure that this is a really vibrant red. And this is a little bit more transparent of a red, so you will see some of these lines showing through while you're painting. But that's perfectly fine, because when we are adding our window panes in there, you'll notice that they're going to reflect what's around them. So instead of having to worry so much about all those little details of colors reflecting, or seeing through the telephone booth through the glass, these other little transparent lines that we're painting in will give you that illusion. So just saving yourself a few steps. So we're just going to paint all of this in. And anywhere where you're doing a line on the inside, what I like to do is just load up the edge of my brush, and then I will start painting from there, and I'll just go right along that line. And just like what we did with our rails here, it just gives you the chance to paint without worrying about your bristles moving around on you or spreading when you are painting in like a longer line. So you just want to continue loading up your brush like that to create those lines. And then sometimes, again, it always helps to turn it a little bit where you feel like you have more control over what you're doing. And then I'll just go along that edge of that bottom line. And again, I'm just trying to avoid this area. This paint is drying so quickly that I don't even really have to worry about putting my hand over the black. But if that area is still a little damp, what you can do is just wait for that to dry, and that will prevent you from accidentally like setting your hand and moving that wet paint around your canvas. And you can always take your time with this. I'm working a little bit faster, but since you will have a recording of the session, you don't necessarily have to speed paint like this. If you have an area where you paint outside the line and you're worried about it, you don't necessarily have to clean it up if you don't want to. I'm just going to show you quickly what to do if you place something on the canvas and you don't like where that's at. So while your brush or your paint is still damp, you can add a little bit of water to a clean brush. And then if you gently go over that area that you're trying to pick up with your paint, it will dilute that paint. And then you can just use a paper towel to blot that area up. So that's like a really quick fix if you're worried about something. And this is like if you really put something down that you don't like, but that was just cleaning up this edge along here. But again, if things are a little bit wobbly or something, it's no problem. I just tend to have more like OCD moments. It's just who I am. But I tend to do a lot of technical work with my own art, so it's just something that is hard to break once you have those habits. But I love seeing painters that don't do that. Like sometimes I'm a little too tight with my painting. So I would say just paint the way that you like. If you're a little bit more a messy painter, that's perfectly fine. Sometimes I want to be that way. So it's just hard. So again, I'm making sure that there's a lot of paint on the end of my brush, and then you can do those nice crisp lines. Okay, so we're getting there. So the next thing that we're going to do really quick while this is drying is we want to make sure that this piece right here feels like it's planted within the rest of our painting. So right now it kind of looks like it's floating there. So what we'll do is add just a little bit of shadows around this bottom edge of the telephone booth. We're going to add a few along the lines here of the railway so it doesn't look like, again, they're all separate pieces. So I'm going to go back to using my small round brush. So I'm getting things out of order. Okay. I'm going to dip it in my water. And for this one, you can use like the edge of your brush if you want to create some of those lines, or you can use your angled brush here if you have one of these, and then you can just go right along that bottom edge with that. So I'll leave that up to you. And what we're going to do is just going to mix a little bit darker of a color than what we already have on that boardwalk area. So I'm just working from that little puddle of paint that we already had. And this is turning into like a nice royal purple or like a deep violet. And I can go even darker with that if I wanted with a little bit more blue. And a tiny bit more red. So the blue tends to overpower other colors. So you tend to have to mute that down with a little bit more of the red. That'll look nice. So I'm just going to go along the edge of that. And like I said, you can use whatever brush that you'd like. Go along the edge of the side. We're going to do those same kind of angled brush strokes. And then if you have your other round brush, you can always pull those lines out a little bit so it doesn't look like a big blob in itself. Do the same thing in a few other spots of the boardwalk area. So I can just butt that up right against that railway a little bit. Just to create a sense of depth and shadow within the piece. So we're not going too crazy with it. Just want to make sure that it's like firmly planted. And I'm going to go just a tiny bit darker on part of this. I have to add just a little bit of black. Just on one little section of it. Because I felt that was like a little too purpley tone. So that has a little bit more of a blue tone to it. You can have some of this also coming along sides of the piece if you want to break up more of that purpley tone just a tiny bit more. And if for some reason you feel like you go a little bit too dark with it, you can always bring some of those lighter colors back in by adding a little bit of white to that. I'm just gonna let that sit. And you can see how at this angle, since this is reflecting a lot, how that creates more of those shadows. You can always paint that out just a tiny bit more in certain areas. But what always helps is you can always take a quick break from your painting for a few minutes, step away from it, and then when you come back, you can see other little details that you can add while you're working. Okay, so this probably needs a little bit more time to dry here. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to start putting in the trees for the piece. And like I said earlier, you can choose how much branches you want in this piece. So this one has quite a few where it's separated into other branches, or you can keep it simple and then just have 2 trees along the side, and that looks nice as well. So it's whatever you think is best for your design. The thing you want to make sure of though is that you're not covering over too much of Big Ben. So with this other color that we just mixed where we diluted our black, this is where we can still work with this little puddle of color if it's still damp. And what I'm going to do is add just a little bit of ultramarine blue to it, just to create that connection of colors within the painting. Just livens up that black paint a little bit more. And we want to make sure this is also that inky consistency. So if you need to mix more paint, just make sure you dilute that with a little bit of water. Creates like this nice blue-black, which will be perfect for our trees. So with this one, I'm using this angled brush. This is just my go-to a lot of times while I'm working. But you can use any brush in this set. You can use the filbert, you can use the large round. And the idea of it is that when you're painting the base of the tree, we're going to start from the bottom. And then as we work our way around, what you'll do is just slightly rotate your brush where you're using like the edge of it to create some of those lighter lines. So like those wispy thin branches, we're going to be using more of the edge of our brush for it. So that's why I like this angled one for it. But I'll show you a few little tricks with it while you're painting if you run into any sort of frustrations. There's a few little things that you can do to make your trees look better. But for right now, what we're going to do is just add in the trunk of our tree and create our main lines for our tree. So I'm just going to start from the bottom area here. And I'm going to let my hand wiggle with its natural shake, especially with trees because they don't really have any sort of straight lines with them. And I'm just going to curve it a little bit more towards Big Ben. And then while I'm doing this, I'm just curving my brush. So as I rotate it, it's creating a thinner line while it's going up to those larger branches. And you'll see here, this is the first thing that happens when you're painting in a tree. And the first thing that you'll want to notice is the line weight, which is basically how wide your lines are. If you feel like too much of your tree is the same width, it's easy to fix. But like right now, this doesn't look so much like a tree yet until we add in those details. So to break this up so it doesn't just look like one squiggly black line on my canvas, I want to make sure that as I move down to the base of the tree or the trunk of the tree, it's going to be a little bit wider. So here I know I'm probably just going to have to block this area in. And that's an easy fix for that part. But I also will probably just bring this base down a little bit more. So sometimes it helps to work from like the center out after you put in that main line. And that will create a little bit more of a line variation or change in line weight while you're working. So it still looks a little strange right now because I want to add another branch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dip back into my paint. And I'm just going to create another branch that splits off from this section here. So I'm going to start with the flat side of the brush, and then I'm just going to rotate it a little bit. And then you can kind of naturally wiggle your hand a little bit if you'd like. And that will create that line. And you can always create like more little splits within the tree if you'd like. So there's no real wrong way of doing this. I might do just another little split right here. So this is another thing that you can do if you feel like your branches are not really connecting to each other. For example, let me just clean this off really quick. So for example, I just put in this line here, right? And sometimes they'll start looking like they're just chopped on the ends. And if you're worried about using that same brush because you feel like you don't have as much control over it, what you can do is switch to your small round brush. And this is just a number 6. I'm just going to rotate this so it's easier for me to see what I'm doing. But from this little area, what you can do is with a little bit of paint on your round brush, you can hold it at a vertical angle and just flick that little line out more. Kind of like you're flicking eyeliner. And that just gives you a little bit more control over those small lines. Another thing to think about is where these lines connect to each other. So like I said earlier, where you have lines here where you want to emphasize that shape, but you don't want to create like a heavy outline. What you can do with this case is you're going to emphasize this intersecting line here with the other one by just making this part a tad bit wider. And you would see that normally in trees as well, but we're just amplifying that line a little bit more, so then it creates a more natural looking tree that has weight to it. And then what you can always do is you can always add in a few more squiggly lines in areas if you feel like your tree is just a little too curved, like there's not enough variation in like the bumps of the tree and the bark of the tree. But we're not going to go too far with that. Those are just common things that happen while you're painting. And you can always split off into other little sections of the tree as well. Now we're going to do the same thing on this other side here. We just want to make sure that we're not covering over Big Ben. We will add in some leaves and other things later, just so it doesn't look too wintry. So I'm going to go back to using my angled brush. Just load up my paint again. And then I'm just going to add another tree along the side. So again, we're starting with this major line here where everything can come off of. And then you'll notice that I'm angling my brush towards the edge as I work my way up. And after you do it a few times, it starts to become a little bit more natural to you and you won't even realize you're doing it. But it's just something to point out while I'm teaching, just so it doesn't feel like you're having less control over your design. So we've got that major line in now. And what I'm going to do is, I know I want to add a little split here with the tree. So I have these two lines. Obviously, these are intersecting. So you'll see like up here, this line is a little bit wider than down here, which is unnatural for a tree. So I know that I need to make this line down here thicker to thin out that one. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm just trying to show you all the little tricks that you can do. So again, it's easier to kind of go from the middle part of your tree branch if you're making adjustments. And then obviously down here, I need to thicken up the tree as well. So I can just make that a little bit wider towards the base. Like that. Now this is getting a little bit transparent here, so I know that I need to add a little bit more paint to my mixture, and that will make it more opaque. I was just having a lot of water on my brush, which is fine when you're putting in these major lines. You can always go back in and touch them up with a little bit of darker paint when they dry. So I can always put a few more little lines here and there. I'm not thinking too hard about it because I know that I'm going to be adding in leaves and other parts on the top of my painting. And again, this is where I'm going to switch back to my small round brush. You can see here this tree branch needs a little bit of work. It feels like it's cut off right there. So I can always go back in and flick that out a little bit. And then I can always thicken up parts of that branch so it looks a little bit more natural. So it's just kind of a push and pull between where you need to add branches or just make small adjustments to the one that are already on your canvas. Okay. So that's probably all I'll put in for this one, but you can always do more. And if you need to, you can add a little bit more paint in areas if you feel like it's just a little bit too transparent. Because you always want to make sure that it looks intentional. What I'll also do while this is still a little bit damp is we're going to add a few little highlighted areas to create that effective tree bark. So you'll see along here, all I did was add a little bit of my red, blue, and white to create that muted color again. And with my small round brush, some of that you might already even still have on your paper plate here. This one's a little bit purple, so I'm gonna make it just a tiny bit bluer. And add a little bit of white, kind of like a muted baby blue. And then I'm just gonna go in a few areas and add some little highlights on my tree branches. And this is also a good way of like covering over a spot that you're not totally in love with. You can make it look like a little highlighted area on your tree. And I don't mind if this is mixing in with some of my black paint on there, that's perfectly fine. Lift this because it's really glossy right now. Just in a few areas. This is also good where if you have like overlapping tree branches like I have right here, I can go in and I can choose which one I want to be on top of the other one. And that just creates a little bit of variety there. And if for some reason you feel like you put down too much of that color, you can always go back in with your black blue paint and push that tone back. So there's no real way of, doing this wrong. It's just a push and pull between highlights and shadows. And we're also just trying to make sure that we're not just having these shapes sitting on the canvas without any sort of texture after we did other texture within our piece. So it's just a way of like connecting everything together. Connecting the colors, connecting the brush strokes that we're using. And it just makes everything look just a little bit more natural, even though we're doing a painting that's, not photographic at all in nature. Okay. So we're getting close with everything. There's only a few more steps that we have to do for this. So in this case, if this is dry along here, what we'll do next is we're going to use our stencil to block in the white panels on our telephone booth. So again, you just want to make sure that these line up and that they're going in the right direction. And if you have tape at home or anything, that works really well for what you're doing. Or you can use your fingers to hold it in place. This one's a little bit more wobbly because I just used it earlier. But that's perfectly fine. And the nice thing about this paint is it has a little bit of like tackiness to it. So when you set down your piece of paper here, it tends to want to stick to it a little bit anyway. But while you're working, you just want to make sure that you're gently holding down those sections while you're painting. Of course, there's always going to be a little bit that pulls up underneath these lines. However, we can always make little changes to it after it dries. Just saves you a lot of time and energy blocking in these major shapes. So in this case, I'm going to use my small flat brush. This is the number 6 flat. And this is kind of like a perfect size for what we're doing because it can go just right in between these smaller lines here. Now, if you have a larger painting, like a 16 by 20, you might want to use a larger brush, like the angled brush or the large filbert to cover areas. But for this one, I'm just going to use this size because I feel like I have a little bit more control over it. So in this case, we want our white paint to be very opaque. So I want to make sure that I'm not diluting my white paint down too much. So after dipping my brush into my water just to soften the bristles, I'm going to go directly into my white paint. And I'm just going to gently start covering over these little stenciled areas. And again, you're probably going to have a little bit of buildup of that white paint on parts of it, but this will save you so much headache while you are putting in these little glass panels. However, with stencils, they tend to look like stencils on the canvas. So we're going to do a few little tricks with glazing and other colors that we're going to put on the canvas to make this look less like a stencil and more connected to the rest of your painting. But I have kind of like a love-hate relationship with stencils because they do tend to be a little bit jarring when placed against other parts of your painting. But if you know how to add a few little details and just push those colors back a little bit, you can make it look really good. There's also little dabbers that you can buy and stuff. I just tend to use my paintbrush while I do this. And you're just doing your best not to move this around too much on your canvas. And I know the tendency is to want to like press really hard on your stencil to hold it in place. But when you do that, sometimes you're creating a gap in your stretched canvas and your stencil, and that's going to create like a bigger pool of that color. So you really just need a tiny bit of pressure while you're doing this point. So I just wanted to thank you again for joining the session. I know there's a lot going on in the world right now, a lot of uncertain things happening. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of distraction and gives you just a chance to relax and do something fun. And hopefully, your friends and family are safe and healthy during all of this. It'll hopefully be over soon. But I always think art is like good therapy when you're going through chaotic times. And even when it's not chaotic times, it's just good for your brain. Everybody needs a chance to be creative. Okay. So I know some of this pulled up while I was working. I am not worried about it because I can always make a few little changes to it as I go. So I'm just going to gently lift this up. And then we have our guidelines that we need. And you can see there's just some little puddles of color and area. What you can do is with your small round brush, your smallest one, which is like the number 0, and a paper towel, you can, with a little bit of water on your paintbrush, you can just gently go over some of those areas if you feel like there's big globs of paint in areas that you're worried about drying. And I'm just blotting off any excess paint that builds up on my brush after I go over some of these lines. And it's going to move your paint a little bit on your canvas, but you can easily see where those lines are supposed to be when you're touching it up with red paint later. But this will prevent you from jumping right in with your red paint immediately when your white is still dry, because if you do that, you're just going to create like a pinky tone and you're going to keep going over that area more and more times. You might just end up like frustrating yourself a little bit. I know I did that in my original one where I just get impatient sometimes and I'm like, I want to get this done. So doing a step like this can smooth out any of those areas that might be problematic in your piece. But you don't necessarily have to do this step. I would just recommend waiting for your white paint to dry a little bit more before just jumping in with the red. And a lot of these, aren't in use anymore since people don't really use telephone booths. So we're going to create one that's a little bit more rustic, like the ones that we see around villages nearby. So this one is based off of the one that I see going through Lake and Heath Village, but many of them are in a lot of these little local areas. And they're a little bit weathered, you know, so we can amplify that within this piece. Okay. So I'm gonna let this dry down a little bit. And what we're gonna do next is, it looks like my paint is dry for my trees. So instead of jumping right into this, which I definitely want to do right now, but I know I shouldn't, I'm going to work on another part of my painting. So I tend to go in sections of my painting while I'm working, just to prevent myself from frustration or overworking the design. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our darker leaves within our piece. So I have a few variations of this. I have one where you can have leaves where they're more blotted here, or you can have them be more designed. You can be a little bit more stylized with the piece. So it depends on what you'd like to do. But for this, we want to create a slightly darker leaf to create a little bit more dimension and shadow within the top of our painting here. So I'm going to use my small number 6. And we're going to use a similar color to what we have in the bottom of our painting. So we're using some of our blue, some of our red, and that's going to create like a burgundy color that we'll use for our shadowed leaves. And you might need to add just a little bit of water to your mixture, because right now, like I said, all of the humidity and the changes in weather, especially when a storm is happening, just tends to like suck the moisture right out of the air, or at least right out of these paints. So on, like I said earlier, on more humid days, you might just want to have a little bit more water on your brush within your paints, and then you won't be fighting your material as much. Okay. So this is where we can choose where we want some of these leaves to go. You can either have a winter scene like this, or we can just add in a few little spots of leaves. And so since this is like a pointed brush, what I'm doing is just gently dragging a little bit when I place the brush on the canvas, and that will create some of those leaf shapes for you. And I'm not thinking too hard about the placement of them, because most likely I'm going to create a pattern. And then sometimes I'll turn my brush in the opposite direction, so the leaves are pointing in a different direction on my piece. And that might feel unnatural to you, so you can always turn your canvas upside down if you want to do that part. And that way you're pulling the brush towards you versus like holding it like this. I just tend to hold it like that when I do parts of my painting. I blame it on like being left-handed. I do everything kind of strange sometimes. You can have them overlap some of the trees. You can have some look like they're falling if you want. And some people like to go ham with this, where they just have tons of leaves in the tree. And it's really fun to do that while you're painting. You just want to make sure that you keep that intention somewhat with where your brush strokes are going, just so it doesn't get so busy up here that it takes away from the rest of your design. And then when you're working, you can start working really fast once you get the hang of it and feel comfortable holding the brush in a certain way. And I'll probably do a few down here too, just to make that space a little bit less empty. Give the illusion of like a bush or something that's back there, or another part of the tree. And I'm making sure I'm not going too far over on Big Ben and the clock tower, that whole area. Probably did a little too much here, but I'm going to leave it. Because I can still see some of that spire in the background. So then we can let that dry a little bit, and then we'll do our red leaves on top of it a little bit later. But at this point, your white paint should be getting pretty dry now. And this small brush, this detail brush, the number 0, is really good for getting in between some of these lines. So if I need to, I can start doing that. Or if you want to create more of that effect where you have that glazing with this lighter purple tone, like what we see in some of the design, where you have just a little bit of red in areas. I have a few renditions of this. Painted this quite a few times now. You can have a little bit more of that purpley tone in areas to create a reflection. I tend to do that first before cleaning up too many of my lines, because most likely I'm going to have to clean up those lines a little bit more anyway. So with the same mixture that we have, I'm just going to take a little scoop of it and add a tiny bit of water to it. And this is where we get this faux glazed effect. So typically you would use like matte medium or glazing medium for it. But as long as we don't put too much water with it, we can do this effect. If you add too much, it tends to kind of break down your paints, and it creates more of like a grainy texture with it. So you don't get necessarily the effect that you always want. But I always tell my students, try and work with what you have first before you rush out and buy something that you might not necessarily need for your project. So I'm just going to add a little bit of this in this area. And it's really easy to feel like you need to buy a lot of art supplies because you're like, oh man, if I had this one color or this one thing, I would be able to do like this perfect project. And I find myself doing that too, where in reality, like you probably don't need those things right away unless you absolutely need that color or something. But it's really easy to convince yourself that purchasing an item is going to give you the effect that you want with your painting, when in reality, like you may just need to practice a little bit more, or experiment more with your colors and your designs while you're working. And I think we all do it. It's just something that is like psychological. I think we're all kind of trained to buy stuff. So especially in like creative fields, art supplies can get really expensive. So, if you have the money, you want to try it, that's perfectly fine. I don't want to tell you how to spend your money. But if you feel like that's becoming something that's more of like a crutch while you're working, I would say to try and avoid buying art supplies for just even like a week or so, and see how far you can take what you have in your supplies. I hope that makes sense. I always have to tell my students this too, because a lot of them won't eat. They won't eat food, but they'll buy like the most expensive paints at the store because they feel like that's going to make a better painting for them. And I did it in art school too. I ate a lot of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. So I just don't want anybody else to suffer like that when you have, you probably have what you need. That's just my little tangent. So again, we're just adding a little bit of this purpley tone to create that glazed effect. So we're seeing some of that white shining through. We're seeing a little bit of that red shining through. And then we're just gonna let that dry down a little bit. And then with that same glaze, we're gonna go in with a few other spots on our painting. So you'll notice in the examples where this line is being formed with that glaze. The reason for that is we want to make sure that this has like a three-dimensional form with it. So this would be like the back part of the telephone booth and the side. And we can give it more of like a rustic or vintage effect with it. So to make it look like less of a stencil with your brush, you can just gently add a few little lines. And they don't even have to be connected. It's just enough to give you that illusion of shape. And I'm gonna pull this towards the camera a little bit so you can see more of what I'm doing. And the reason why you don't have to do like a perfect line down it is because it's like connect the dots where your brain is already going to connect it on its own. And form patterns and form lines. It's just what we do without even acknowledging it. So you don't have to put heavy lines anywhere if you don't want to. It can just be a very subtle little line in areas. And I'm going to put some of that glaze in a few other spots. I might need to make it a tad bit darker. It's getting a little bit too watery, and that's not necessarily what you want. So anywhere where there's like a ledge here, I can make that a little bit darker. And we're just pushing back that red just a little bit more so it gives you that illusion of shadows. We're also going to do it across this top part here, just in this corner. And it's like creating a watercolor effect with it, where you're just doing this slight tonal shift with that more purpley tone. I'm going to go along this outer edge too. And you can spend a long time working on this. I'm just showing you a little thing, a couple things you can do to make your telephone booth look more three-dimensional and less like a stencil. So I won't spend too much time on this, but if you're at home and you have the time, you can spend as much energy as you want on creating like the perfect telephone booth. And some people will actually push this back a little bit more. So I'm going back and forth between adding a little bit more of that purple to my paint so it's slightly more opaque in areas. Uh-oh, hear my cat crying. 1 second. Okay. So I'm just holding this at an angle so you can see again what I'm working on. And I apologize if you can hear my cat eating right now. He usually ends up on all of these Zoom sessions in some way. And I can use like the broad side of my brush to push that color around a little bit in areas. And again, we're avoiding using any sort of black paint or anything that might mute down our colors. So it's just like pushing and pulling where you want that paint to go. You can always dilute it with a little bit of water if you feel like you put too much down in a spot, or if you want to move it to a different direction of your painting. You can pull up some of it and just wipe it off on your paper towel if you want, just like you would with watercolor. Now, since this part is dry here, another thing you can do to push some of these lines a little bit more before we add those final red ones is with this purple paint that I still have mixed here. It's like a dark blue violet color. I'm just going to add a few little lines to emphasize the spaces in our telephone box. So I tend to put them across like this top line here to create that like illusion of a shadow. So this is just a slightly deeper tone than our glaze that we just put on there. And I'm keeping my brush at an almost vertical angle just to prevent it from becoming too wide. And I'm just going along each of these little sections here. And that just creates more of that illusion of depth. It also cleans up a few lines that you might have that you don't like. I might put just a little bit more on this edge here. Yeah, that looks better. Sometimes you really have to push some of those shadows too. So don't be afraid to go a little bit darker in areas if you need to. Another thing that we'll do is I'm gonna use a little bit of just my solid red paint too. Like if things look a little bit murky. Oh no, my cat wants to join. Please don't. Come on. There we go. Sorry. So I can dip directly into my red paint, and then I can pull out a little bit more of that red. Oh no, please don't do it. He really wants to join this class. Hello. Okay, you stay there. Okay. 1 second, buddy. We just finished painting. So I can add a little bit more red in areas. Hi. Hi, buddy. Okay, sorry. It's nothing I mean, I'm sure some of you have children, so I can't imagine what it's like to paint with your kid trying to get your attention, but that's exactly what's going on here. So I'm just adding some more of this red in to a few spots just to bring that color back a little bit so it's not so muted. And this is also where I can start going in and touching up a few spots on the panels here. So I'm just going to make sure that my brush is at a vertical angle, and I'm just going to touch up a few little areas here. And you just want to like barely touch the canvas when you do this part. So the very end of the brush is the only thing that's cleaning up those lines. And it shouldn't be too many lines that you have to touch up, but it all just depends on how well that stencil pulled up when you were working. And you can always add another layer of white in spots if you need to, just to make that pop out more in your booth part here. You can, if you're really good with your paintbrush, you can paint in where it says telephone, or you can put in your name. You can do whatever you want in that section. So the last thing I'll do on the booth here is I know I want to add a few little highlight lines and just clean up a few pieces on here that I feel like got a little bit messy. But just to give the illusion again of some more reflection, I'm going to go in with just a tiny bit of white in areas, just to pull that color forward a little bit. And I'm just barely going over part of these lines or these little spaces in the telephone booth. Just give that illusion of reflection and light. And I can always do a few little other highlight lines too. So if I want some things to stand out in a few spots, I can do some highlighted areas as well, along any sort of curved lines that I want to emphasize. Or if I need to emphasize this line right here a little bit more, I can just do a tiny bit of white just to bring that forward. That's pretty much that for the telephone booth. Like I said, you can always go further with your designs if you'd like. But for me, sometimes I just think it's easier to kind of let it sit, and then you can come back later if you see something that bothers you while you're working. I think that looks pretty good. Okay. And then the last thing we'll do is we're just going to put in our red leaves. So I'm going to go back to my number 6 round that I used for my leaves. And most of these up here should be dry now. So what I'll do is I'm just going to dip into my red paint. You might need to add a little bit of water to your red paint if it feels a little bit dry. And then you can just paint in some red leaves wherever you'd like. You can always turn them in a different direction if you want. I tend to just turn my brush, but you can turn your canvas if that's more comfortable for you. Like I said, you can go crazy with this part of your painting if you want. I know a lot of people like this step in the painting. Just gonna add that in a few little areas. You can always add little details to your trees if you want. You can have like a little carved heart if you want to make it look romantic, since these have kind of a Valentine's Day vibe to them. And just make it your own, you know, there's plenty of things you can do that turn it into your own piece where it's not just a recreation of another design. Because everybody's very creative. I'm sure you're coming up with wonderful ideas. You can have some look like they're falling again if you want. And that's pretty much it. So the last thing I typically do is just initial in the bottom right corner. And, you know, some people don't feel comfortable doing that with a paintbrush, so you can always do that with a Sharpie or something if you'd like. Or some people will just put their information on the back of their paintings. So I'll leave that up to you. I tend to work a little bit bigger with my signatures and just keep it really simple on designs like this. But with my other paintings, like if I have a chance to write in pencil or something, I typically do, just because I have more control over that than a paintbrush. But you can do like a really delicate signature if you'd like. I'm just going to keep mine really simple and just have my initials on that bottom. But I hope you like the class. Please let me know if you have questions or run into any issues while you're working. And I would love to see your final designs. So hopefully I'll see you at an upcoming class. And I hope you have a great time with the rest of your weekends. Thank you again.